The morning of April 16th, 1945, broke clear over Okinawa. Lieutenant Seizo Yasunori climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi Zero fighter at Kanoya Air Base on the southern coast of Kyushu. He was 23 years old and had been flying for 11 months. Around him, 53 other pilots prepared for the same mission. They would not return. This was Kikusui No. 3, the third mass kamikaze operation against the American invasion fleet surrounding Okinawa. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yasunori carried in his flight suit a photograph of his mother and a letter he had written 3 days earlier. He had been trained to believe that his death would damage or sink an American warship, that his sacrifice would contribute meaningfully to Japan's defense. What he could not know, what Japanese naval intelligence had failed to understand for over 2 years, was that American ships possessed a weapon that would kill him long before he reached his target. A technology so advanced that Japanese engineers who later examined captured examples refused to believe it could function as designed. The weapon was not a gun, it was a shell. More precisely, it was a fuse installed in the nose of that shell. The Americans called it the Variable Time Fuse, abbreviated VT. The designation was deliberate misdirection. The fuse had nothing to do with time. It was a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver that could detect nearby aircraft and detonate automatically at optimal killing range. Each fuse contained 130 electronic components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, all hardened to survive 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired from a naval gun. The technology represented a revolution in anti-aircraft warfare. For Japanese pilots like Yasunori, it transformed American ships from difficult targets into nearly impenetrable fortresses, defended by invisible fields of precisely timed explosions. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots who survived encounters with proximity-fused shells reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become supernaturally accurate, that shells seemed to follow aircraft through evasive maneuvers, that explosions occurred exactly where aircraft would be rather than where they had been. None of them understood why. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how this technology came to dominate the Pacific War begins not with military planning, but with a fundamental problem in physics and mathematics that had plagued anti-aircraft gunners since the First World War. Hitting a fast-moving aircraft with a shell fired from a ship required predicting exactly where that aircraft would be 15 to 30 seconds in the future, then manually setting a mechanical time fuse to explode the shell at precisely that moment. The mathematics were unforgiving, and the margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. On December 7, 1941, as Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, American gunners fired thousands of rounds skyward. Most exploded harmlessly in empty air. Some never exploded at all. Others, their contact fuses still armed, fell back to Earth in Honolulu 9 miles from the harbor. 68 civilians died that morning. 32 of them were killed not by Japanese bombs, but by American anti-aircraft shells that had been fused incorrectly or had failed to detonate at altitude. The tragedy illustrated with brutal clarity that existing technology was inadequate against modern aircraft. The British had discovered this reality earlier. During the evacuation of Dunkirk in May and June of 1940, German Stuka, dive bombers attacked ships crowded with retreating soldiers. British anti-aircraft guns fired continuously. Ships carried limited ammunition. Magazine space was finite. More guns meant less space for other critical systems. Better optical rangefinders helped, but could not overcome the fundamental limitation of time fuses that required perfect prediction of an aircraft's future position against a target that could change course or altitude instantly. In August of 1940, the National Defense Research Committee in Washington approached Dr. Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism with an assignment that seemed impossible. Tuve had spent his career studying the ionosphere using radio waves. In 1925, working with Gregory Bright, he had pioneered techniques for measuring radio wave reflection from the upper atmosphere. This research laid theoretical foundations for radar. When asked about developing a proximity fuse for artillery shells, Tuve understood immediately that radio physics might provide a solution that conventional engineering could not. The concept was elegant in theory. A miniature radio transmitter in the nose of a shell would broadcast continuously as the shell flew toward its target. When the shell approached an aircraft, radio waves would reflect back from the metal structure. The frequency of reflected signals would shift due to the Doppler effect as the distance decreased. An electronic circuit would detect this frequency shift and trigger detonation when the shell reached optimal range. Simple in concept. Impossible in execution given the technology available in 1940. The challenge was not just miniaturization, but survival. A 5-inch naval shell experienced acceleration of 20,000 times normal gravity when fired. At 20,000 gravities, a component weighing 1 ounce would effectively weigh 1,250 pounds for the fraction of a second it took the shell to travel down the gun barrel. Forces of this magnitude turned solid steel into fragments. Delicate electronic components made of glass and thin metal filaments could not possibly survive. Also, conventional engineering wisdom insisted. Tuve organized Section T of the National Defense Research Committee in a former automobile dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. Security was absolute. Neighbors speculated about mysterious activities behind blackout curtains. The cover story described research into optical instruments. The reality was a crash program to develop what Allied military leaders believed could alter the course of the war. The development process revealed cascading engineering challenges that each seemed insurmountable until solved through innovation that pushed the boundaries of what existing technology could achieve. Vacuum tubes were the only electronic amplifying devices available in 1940. Standard radio tubes stood 6 inches tall and weighed several ounces. They were fragile glass envelopes containing delicate filaments and electrodes suspended in vacuum. The most rugged tubes manufactured for military use in mobile radios could withstand 10 gravities of acceleration. The proximity fuse required tubes that could survive 20,000 gravities while continuing to function as precise electronic amplifiers. Western Electric Company and Radio Corporation of America received urgent requests to develop tubes that existing physics suggested could not exist. Engineers discovered that conventional tube assembly techniques produced devices that shattered instantly under high acceleration. Glass formulations required modification with additives that increased strength while maintaining vacuum seals necessary for electron flow. Internal components needed embedding in shock-absorbing materials. Electrode structures required complete redesign, using spot welding techniques that created mechanical bonds capable of surviving extreme stress. By spring of 1941, after thousands of design iterations and manufacturing experiments, acceptable tubes emerged from production lines. They measured less than 1 inch in height and could survive forces that would pulverize conventional electronics. The power source presented equally severe challenges. A battery that could provide sufficient voltage and current had to fit inside the limited space available in the shell nose. It had to survive gun launch forces. Most critically, it had to remain inert during storage and transportation, then activate automatically when the shell was fired. Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman at the National Bureau of Standards developed a solution that was as ingenious as it was simple. A glass tube filled with electrolyte solution was sealed with metal plates at each end. When the shell sat in storage, the liquid remained in the center of the tube, isolated from metal contacts. When fired, centrifugal force from the shell's rotation pushed the electrolyte outward against small pieces of metal embedded in the tube walls. Chemical reaction between electrolyte and metal generated electrical current. The battery activated only when the shell was spinning, providing built-in safety that prevented premature detonation. On May 6, 1941, at Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia, 6 prototype fuses were tested in air-dropped bombs over water. Radio transmitters activated. Receivers detected reflections from the water surface. Electronic circuits triggered detonators. All 6 bombs exploded at correct altitude. The success validated basic concept, but bombs experienced only a few hundred gravities of acceleration when released from aircraft. Artillery shells presented a challenge 2 orders of magnitude greater. By June of 1941, Section T had expanded to over 100 engineers, physicists, and ordnance specialists, working in conditions of absolute secrecy. The antenna had to be small enough to fit in the nose cone, while remaining efficient enough to transmit and receive radio signals at frequencies that would provide usable Doppler shift. Engineers developed a ring antenna circling the fuse body. The transmitter circuit had to generate radio frequency signals at 70 to 90 MHz using just 3 miniaturized vacuum tubes. The receiver circuit had to detect signals 1/millionth the strength of transmitted power and amplify them sufficiently to trigger detonation circuitry. December 7, 1941, transformed the proximity fuse project from important research to absolute priority. The attack on Pearl Harbor eliminated all skepticism about whether electronics could survive gun launch. The Navy had watched time-fused shells prove inadequate against maneuvering aircraft. Production contracts expanded from millions to hundreds of millions of dollars. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory was founded on March 10, 1942 to centralize development. 5 companies received contracts to mass-produce fuses following designs that had been perfected through countless iterations. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris committed entire factories to fuse production. The goal was ambitious beyond precedent: 40,000 fuses per day by late 1943, 70,000 per day by war's end. Each fuse contained approximately 130 miniaturized parts that had to be manufactured to exacting specifications and assembled by workers who were never told what the final product would do. Different companies manufactured different sub-assemblies. The designation variable time fuse was chosen specifically to mislead anyone who might learn of the project. Even after combat use began, intelligence analysts examining captured fuses that had failed to detonate assumed they represented some kind of advanced time mechanism rather than miniaturized radar. On August 12, 1942, the cruiser USS Cleveland conducted comprehensive testing of production proximity fuses against drone aircraft in Chesapeake Bay. 3 radio-controlled target drones simulated aerial attack. Cleveland's 5-inch guns required fewer than 10 rounds to destroy all 3 aircraft on the first day of testing. Naval authorities immediately cancelled the remainder of the scheduled 2-day test and authorized mass production and fleet deployment. In tests conducted over the previous 2 years, time-fused shells had required an average of 2,500 rounds fired per aircraft destroyed. Proximity-fused shells demonstrated 25-fold improvement in effectiveness. The first combat-ready fuses reached fleet units in October of 1942. The cruiser USS Helena received 500 rounds of proximity-fused 5-inch ammunition carefully distributed throughout her magazines to prevent accidental disclosure if the ship was damaged. Instructions emphasized that proximity fuses were to be used only over water, where duds would sink beyond enemy recovery. Gunners received training but were not told how the fuses actually functioned. Initial fleet reaction ranged from skepticism to curiosity. The effectiveness in combat would resolve all doubts within weeks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The morning of January 5, 1943, in Kula Gulf off Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Red Cochran gripped the fire control director aboard USS Helena as 4 Aichi dive bombers completed their attack run against the American task force. The Japanese aircraft had struck the New Zealand cruiser Achilles and were turning away with characteristic precision. Cochran's crews fired 2 salvos from Helena's aft 5-inch battery. One of the departing Japanese aircraft erupted in flames without being directly hit, torn apart by shrapnel from a shell that had exploded 30 feet away. The pilot never understood what killed him. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet immediately. Ships that had received proximity fuses began using them in every engagement where regulations permitted their employment over water. Cruisers, destroyers, and battleships reported kill ratios that far exceeded anything achieved with conventional time fuses under identical conditions. Enemy pilots noticed something had changed but could not understand why American anti-aircraft fire had suddenly become devastatingly effective. By March of 1943, 25% of all anti-aircraft ammunition issued to the Pacific Fleet contained proximity fuses. These rounds accounted for over 50% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The statistical evidence was compelling and immediate. Proximity fuses proved 3 times more effective per round than conventional time fuses under identical conditions against fast-moving targets. In night engagements, when visual tracking was difficult and time fuses were nearly useless, the advantage increased to 7-fold. Ships that previously had relied on volume of fire, creating walls of steel through which enemy aircraft had to fly, could now achieve kills with a fraction of ammunition expenditure. More importantly, ships could defend themselves effectively with fewer gun crews, reducing casualties when enemy attacks succeeded. Japanese pilots began reporting disturbing patterns. American anti-aircraft fire seemed impossibly accurate. Shells exploded precisely where aircraft were flying rather than where they had been seconds earlier. Evasive maneuvers that had previously made targeting difficult no longer provided safety. Diving, climbing, or turning failed to throw off American gunfire. Some pilots reported that shells seemed to follow them through maneuvers, that American ships possessed some kind of guided ammunition or supernatural ability to predict flight paths. Intelligence officers recorded these reports but could not explain them. The effectiveness of proximity fuses triggered Japanese tactical adaptations that Allied intelligence observed but could not fully explain at the time. Japanese aircraft began attacking from higher altitudes, sacrificing bombing accuracy to remain outside what pilots perceived as a zone of enhanced American defensive capability. Torpedo bombers that had previously approached at wave-top altitude, where they were difficult to track, began coming in higher, making themselves easier targets for radar-directed fire. Dive bombers released weapons at steeper angles to minimize time spent in what pilots described as the killing zone around American ships. These adaptations reduced Japanese strike effectiveness, while failing to restore the tactical advantage they had enjoyed earlier in the war. American ships continued shooting down Japanese aircraft at rates that made conventional attacks unsustainable. Admiral William Halsey, commanding Third Fleet, credited proximity fuses with fundamentally changing the balance of naval air defense. Japanese torpedo bombers had been particularly effective in night attacks when visual tracking was impossible and time fuses were essentially useless. With radar detection combined with proximity fuses, ships could engage aircraft effectively in total darkness. For Japanese aviators, the psychological impact was severe. Pilots who had trained for months, who understood the tactics and risks of attacking defended ships, found themselves dying without understanding why American defenses had become so lethal. The Zero fighter that had dominated Pacific skies in 1942 was still mechanically capable. Japanese pilots still possessed courage and determination, but they were dying in unprecedented numbers to a technology their commanders did not understand and could not counter. The proximity fuse represented a category of weapon that military theorists would later recognize as transformative. It was not merely an improvement in existing capability, but a fundamental change in what was possible. Anti-aircraft gunnery had always required prediction of future target position. Human gunners and mechanical computers made these predictions with limited accuracy. The proximity fuse eliminated prediction by making each shell autonomous, capable of sensing its target and choosing the optimal moment for detonation without human intervention beyond initial aiming and firing. Lieutenant Yasunori, climbing into his Zero on the morning of April 16, 1945, understood none of this. He knew that American anti-aircraft fire was deadly. He had heard stories from pilots who had survived previous missions, tales of shells that exploded with uncanny accuracy, of aircraft disintegrating in mid-flight from explosions that seemed to anticipate their position. But he had been trained that the path of the warrior required accepting death, that his sacrifice would serve the emperor and protect the homeland. At 0830 hours, 54 aircraft lifted from Kanoya Air Base and turned south toward Okinawa. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American radar picket destroyers stationed 30 miles northwest of Okinawa detected the incoming raid at 0900 hours. These destroyers, positioned as early warning outposts, faced the most dangerous assignment in the Pacific Fleet. They were isolated, exposed, and specifically targeted by kamikaze attacks because destroying them would blind American defenses. USS Laffey, a Sumner-class destroyer commanded by Commander Frederick Beckton, was on station at Radar Picket Station 1. Beckton had survived 2 previous command ships sunk by Japanese action. He trained his crew with intensity born from painful experience. At 0940 hours, the first wave of kamikaze aircraft appeared on radar. For the next 80 minutes, Laffey would face 22 separate kamikaze attacks. The destroyer's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range using proximity-fused ammunition. The first Zero fighter disintegrated 4,000 yards from the ship when a proximity-fused shell exploded 15 feet from the aircraft's wing root. The pilot died without reaching attack range. His aircraft's wreckage fell into the sea 2,000 yards short of its target. The effectiveness of proximity fuses in this engagement demonstrated both their capability and their limitations against kamikaze tactics. Conventional aerial attacks saw aircraft approach, release weapons, and attempt escape. Proximity fuses destroyed such attackers at distances where damaged aircraft would miss their targets. Kamikaze attacks eliminated the escape phase. Pilots in damaged aircraft continued toward targets, sometimes surviving long enough to crash into ships even after sustaining damage that would have caused conventional attackers to abort. The solution required concentration of fire that destroyed aircraft completely rather than merely damaging them enough to force withdrawal. Laffey's gun crews fired continuously, creating overlapping zones of proximity-fused explosions that few aircraft could penetrate intact. Yet 6 kamikazes struck the destroyer during the engagement. 4 bombs hit directly. The ship survived through damage control procedures and crew training that Commander Beckton had implemented through relentless drilling, but the attack demonstrated that proximity fuses, while devastatingly effective, could not guarantee absolute protection against determined suicide attack. Japanese naval intelligence struggled to understand why American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased so dramatically after early 1943. Captured American documents made no mention of new ammunition types. Prisoners provided no useful information because most gun crews did not understand how proximity fuses functioned beyond basic operation. Intelligence analysts reviewing battle reports noticed patterns but could not explain them. American ships were shooting down more aircraft per round fired. American defenses remained effective at night and in poor visibility when optical fire control should have been degraded. American anti-aircraft fire seemed less affected by evasive maneuvers that should have complicated targeting. Some Japanese engineers speculated about possible explanations. Perhaps American radar had improved to provide more accurate targeting data. Perhaps fire control computers had been enhanced to calculate future target positions more precisely. Perhaps American gun crews had received better training. The possibility that individual artillery shells carried autonomous target detection capability seemed beyond credible technology. Radio transmitters and receivers small enough to fit in a shell nose, rugged enough to survive gun launch, sensitive enough to detect aircraft and calculate range in the seconds of flight time available, these requirements appeared impossible given understood limitations of electronics. Japanese technical intelligence obtained its first opportunity to examine proximity fuses in December of 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge in Europe. German forces overran an American ammunition dump and captured approximately 20,000 proximity fuses. German ordnance experts examined the devices and concluded they could not possibly function as intended. The technical specifications seemed impossible. Electronics that could survive artillery launch forces were considered beyond current technology. The Germans assumed the fuses represented some kind of advanced time mechanism they did not fully understand. The fuses were warehoused and eventually abandoned as German forces retreated. Japanese intelligence received reports of these German findings but gave them limited credibility. If German experts, acknowledged as world leaders in electronics and weapons development, could not understand captured American fuses, then perhaps the devices were not as sophisticated as initial examination suggested. This failure of imagination, this inability to accept that American technology had achieved breakthroughs that seemed impossible by Japanese and German engineering standards, allowed the proximity fuse to remain operationally secret throughout the war, despite thousands being fired in combat and hundreds failing to detonate and potentially being recovered. The human cost of this intelligence failure was substantial and measurable. Japanese naval aviation lost over 12,000 aircraft in combat during the Pacific War. Documented evidence indicates that proximity fuses directly accounted for destroying several hundred of these aircraft through anti-aircraft fire. Each aircraft lost represented not merely material destruction, but the death of trained aircrew who were impossible to replace. Japan's pilot training programs, which had produced highly skilled aviators before the war, could not keep pace with combat losses after 1942. The death of experienced pilots in 1943 and 1944 forced Japan to commit inadequately trained replacements who fell victim to American defenses at unsustainable rates. By 1945, average flight training for Japanese pilots had dropped from over 500 hours before the war to less than 100 hours. These poorly trained pilots faced American defenders equipped with proximity fuses, radar fire control, and combat air patrols, guided by fighter direction teams aboard ships. The result was systematic destruction of Japanese air power. Lieutenant Yasunori never reached his target on April 16, 1945. American combat air patrol fighters, vectored by radar picket destroyers, intercepted his formation, 30 miles from the invasion fleet. F-6F Hellcat fighters shot down 19 aircraft before any reached attack range. Of the remaining 35 kamikazes that penetrated fighter defenses, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire destroyed 21. 14 aircraft reached their targets. 9 were shot down by close-range automatic weapons fire. 5 crashed into American ships. Yasunori's Zero was hit by proximity-fused 5-inch shells from the destroyer USS Hadley at a range of 6,000 yards. The shell exploded 23 feet from his aircraft. Shrapnel severed control cables and punctured the fuel tank. The engine caught fire. Yasunori attempted to continue toward the nearest American ship but lost control. His aircraft rolled inverted and dove into the sea. He was 23 years old. His death contributed nothing to Japan's defense. His sacrifice, like those of thousands of other kamikaze pilots, was negated by American technology that Japanese commanders did not understand and could not counter. The scale of kamikaze operations during the Okinawa campaign represented Japan's final major aerial offensive of the Pacific War. Between April 1 and June 22, 1945, Japanese forces conducted 10 large-scale kikusui operations involving nearly 1,900 individual kamikaze sorties. These mass attacks were supplemented by hundreds of smaller individual missions. The objective was to inflict sufficient casualties and ship losses that the American invasion would be abandoned or delayed long enough for Japan to negotiate terms that preserved some form of national sovereignty. The strategy failed catastrophically. American ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, integrated radar fire control, and combat air patrol fighters directed by shipboard controllers created defensive systems that Japanese attackers could not overcome. The statistical evidence documented the asymmetry. Kamikaze attacks sank 36 American vessels and damaged 368 others during the Okinawa campaign. These losses represented serious casualties. 4,900 American sailors died, and 4,800 were wounded. Yet the vast majority of ships hit by kamikazes survived, and the invasion proceeded on schedule. Japanese losses were total and irreplaceable. Of the 1,900 kamikaze aircraft launched during Kikusui operations, fewer than 15% reached their targets. The remaining 85% were destroyed by combat air patrols or anti-aircraft fire before completing their attacks. Proximity fuses accounted for a significant percentage of aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire, though precise attribution is complicated by the reality that ships fired both proximity-fused and conventional ammunition during engagements, and that many aircraft were hit by multiple weapons systems. What can be documented with precision is that ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition achieved significantly higher kill ratios than ships firing only conventional ammunition. The Bureau of Ships Analysis, completed in late 1945, examined damage reports from dozens of vessels and concluded that proximity fuses had increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by factors ranging from threefold under optimal conditions to sevenfold in night engagements or against fast-moving targets at long range. These improvements translated directly to reduced ship losses and casualties. The destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley, operating at Radar Picket Station 15 on May 11, 1945, provided dramatic demonstration of both proximity, fuse effectiveness, and the limits of defensive technology against overwhelming attack. Commander Baron Melanie had trained his crew rigorously in damage control and anti-aircraft procedures since the ship's commissioning in November of 1944. For 95 minutes that morning, Hadley and destroyer USS Evans faced waves of Japanese aircraft in what became one of the war's most intense kamikaze engagements. Hadley's gunners shot down 23 enemy aircraft using proximity-fused ammunition, setting a record for aerial victories in single engagement that remains unmatched in naval history. The crew's training and fire discipline kept weapons operational through sustained attack. Combat air patrol fighters vectored by Hadley's fighter direction team shot down additional aircraft before they could reach the destroyers. Yet the sheer number of attackers overwhelmed defensive fire. 4 aircraft and 1 Bucker bomb struck Hadley despite her effective gunnery. The impacts killed 30 crew members and wounded 67 others. Fires engulfed multiple compartments, engineering spaces flooded. The fantail settled low in the water as progressive flooding threatened to break the ship's back. Commander Melanie ordered all but 50 crew members into life rafts, retaining essential damage control personnel to fight fires and maintain enough buoyancy that the ship would not sink before help arrived. The remaining damage control parties kept Hadley afloat through technical skill and determination that reflected months of intensive training. Hadley survived, but was too damaged for combat repair. Tugboats towed the crippled destroyer to Kirama Retto anchorage and eventually back to the United States. She was decommissioned in December of 1945 and sold for scrap in 1947. Her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions on May 11th. Commander Melanie received the Navy Cross. The ship's survival against overwhelming attack demonstrated that well-trained damage control parties using proper techniques could prevent total loss even when defensive systems were penetrated by determined attackers. The proximity fuse's impact extended beyond individual engagements to reshape Japanese tactical planning. By mid-1945, Japanese commanders understood that conventional aerial attacks against American ships were essentially futile. The combination of radar detection, fighter direction, combat air patrols, and what pilots described as supernaturally accurate anti-aircraft fire made traditional bombing and torpedo attacks suicidal missions with negligible chance of success. Kamikaze tactics emerged partly from recognition that proximity to targets improved dramatically if pilots did not need to escape after weapon release. Yet even kamikaze attacks faced diminishing returns as American defenses improved through combat experience. Ships positioned at radar picket stations, the most exposed and frequently attacked vessels in the fleet, developed tactical procedures that maximized proximity fuse effectiveness. Gun crews trained to engage targets at maximum range, creating multiple opportunities to destroy attacking aircraft during their approach. Fire discipline improved so that overlapping zones of fire from multiple ships created barriers that few aircraft could penetrate intact. Damage control procedures evolved to address the specific challenges of kamikaze impacts, which created simultaneous fires in multiple locations and often severed primary firefighting systems. These tactical and procedural adaptations represented organizational learning under extreme pressure. The Navy transformed its doctrine based on combat experience, empowering commanding officers to implement field modifications and tactical innovations without waiting for approval from distant headquarters. Ships arriving at Okinawa in late May and June of 1945 incorporated lessons that earlier vessels had learned through costly experience. Damage control parties trained in techniques developed by crews like Laffey's and Hadley's. Repair facilities stockpiled materials for rapid implementation of proven modifications. The fleet became more effective even as Japanese attacks intensified. The institutional capacity for rapid adaptation represented a fundamental advantage that technology alone could not provide. Proximity fuses gave American ships superior anti-aircraft capability, but that advantage would have been diminished if doctrine had remained static and if sailors had not been empowered to develop improved procedures based on direct combat experience. The combination of technological superiority and organizational flexibility created defensive systems that Japanese forces could not overcome despite their willingness to sacrifice lives in suicide attacks. Japanese military culture struggled with adaptation in ways that compounded the technological disadvantage. The concept of analyzing failures and modifying tactics based on what enemy forces revealed about their capabilities conflicted with cultural expectations that emphasized courage, determination, and adherence to established doctrine. Pilots who returned from unsuccessful missions faced shame rather than being treated as valuable sources of intelligence about American defensive capabilities. This cultural barrier to organizational learning meant that Japanese forces continued employing tactics that had proven ineffective rather than developing new approaches. The proximity fuse development program cost over $1 billion in 1940s currency, a staggering sum that represented a significant fraction of total American weapons research expenditure during the war. By August of 1945, over 22 million proximity fuses had been manufactured through coordination of 87 firms operating 110 factories. Crosley Corporation, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris served as primary assembly contractors with over 2,000 suppliers providing components. At peak production, American industry manufactured 70,000 fuses daily. The cost per fuse dropped from $732 in 1942 to $18 by 1945, as production techniques improved and economies of scale took effect. This dramatic cost reduction made possible the widespread deployment that gave every major combat vessel access to proximity-fused ammunition. Ships arriving in theater received sufficient stocks to engage targets without concern for ammunition conservation. Gun crews could fire at maximum rates knowing that supply logistics would provide replacement ammunition. This abundance of sophisticated munitions represented industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated after the war that the proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan, noting that without the protection this device provided to surface ships, the westward advance could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding fast carrier task forces, recalled that all 5-inch ammunition in 1945 was fitted with proximity fuses, and those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens, preventing ship losses and casualties that would have been enormously larger without this technology. The Japanese never fully understood during the war why American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased so dramatically after early 1943. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military officials revealed that most believed Americans had developed superior fire control radar or had integrated aircraft detection with gun directors in ways Japan could not match. Some Japanese engineers speculated about radio-controlled shells, but dismissed the concept as technically impossible, given the forces involved in gun launch. The idea that individual shells could carry miniaturized radar systems seemed beyond credible technology. This failure of imagination, this inability to accept that American engineering had achieved breakthroughs that violated Japanese understanding of what electronics could survive, allowed the proximity fuse to remain operationally secret throughout the war, despite thousands being fired in combat and hundreds failing to detonate. The psychological dimension of this technological surprise extended beyond individual engagements to affect strategic calculations. Japanese planners had based their defensive strategy partly on assumptions about American casualty tolerance. If kamikaze attacks could sink sufficient ships and kill enough sailors, American public opinion might force negotiated settlement rather than invasion of the home islands. The proximity fuse undermined this strategy by dramatically reducing American casualties per engagement. Ships that would have been sunk by conventional attacks survived because proximity fuses destroyed attacking aircraft before they could reach targets. Sailors who would have died in successful attacks lived because their ships shot down kamikazes at longer ranges. The cumulative effect across hundreds of engagements was that American casualties remained within acceptable bounds, despite facing unprecedented suicide attacks. Japanese strategy failed not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because American technology negated the tactical advantages that kamikaze tactics were designed to exploit. The broader implications of proximity fuse technology extended far beyond World War II into modern military development. The techniques developed for miniaturizing electronics and hardening components to survive high acceleration became foundational for subsequent advances in guided weapons. Missile guidance systems, artillery shells with terminal guidance, and smart munitions that can sense targets and optimize their own detonation all trace conceptual lineage to the proximity fuse. The principle that individual munitions should carry sufficient intelligence to make autonomous decisions represented fundamental shift in weapons design philosophy. Dr. Merle Tuve, returning to the Carnegie Institution after the war, rarely spoke publicly about his role developing proximity fuses. When details were finally declassified and released, Tuve deflected personal credit, emphasizing the contributions of hundreds of engineers and thousands of production workers who transformed theoretical concepts into millions of reliable fuses. His modesty understated his essential leadership in a program that War Department officials ranked second only to the atomic bomb in strategic importance. Without his insight that radio proximity detection could be miniaturized sufficiently for artillery shells, without his persistence through early failures when success seemed impossible, the proximity fuse would have remained theoretical concept rather than combat reality. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.